This is Frank Acland for ECAT World, and today I'm pleased to have with me Hank Mills, who is correspondent for PESN and has spent a lot of time covering cold fusion topics over the years. He's got a lot of knowledge about the ECAT and from its very early days. So, welcome, Hank. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome. Glad to be here.
So let's start out just with a bit of your background as far as your interest in LENR cold fusion. Could you tell us what led you to be interested in cold fusion in the first place?
Well, I remember as a young teenager, I read about cold fusion experiments in an old magazine called Omni. It featured all kinds of topics from space exploration, extraterrestrial life, the paranormal, but it also featured alternative energy articles. And I loved that magazine, and I remember the issue that talked about cold fusion. And then I have a very early memory of my father talking about, probably from the same magazine, an article about cold fusion with some people after church, standing in the churchyard. So those are my two earliest memories, and as I grew older, I continued with my interest in alternative energy, following different technologies and reading everything I could. And eventually, a few years ago, I came across the Journal of Nuclear Physics not long after it opened up, and I started becoming interested in Andrea Rossi's energy catalyzer technology.
How would you compare what Ross's work with other cold fusion technologies that you've learned about?
Well, when it comes to the ECAT, it seems to be superior to any of the other cold fusion or LENR technologies I have came across. It can produce high levels of COP. It can actually produce infinite COP in self-sustain mode. It has demonstrated before. It seems to require, only cheap, common, ordinary materials. It doesn't use palladium, which is expensive, and as far as we know, it only uses ordinary hydrogen. It doesn't have to use, deuterium. Basically, it runs off cheap metals like nickel and lithium and iron, and it just seems superior in just about every way.
Okay. How about cold fusion LENR in comparison with other maybe alternative energy sources that you've studied? I know you've covered some of those at PESWiki once in a while.
There are many potential alternative energy technologies out there. Most of them are not extremely developed. They are either in the theory or very early prototype stages. There's, interesting magnetic motors. There's interesting solid state generators that produce electricity via various mechanisms. Then there's traditional technologies like very advanced solar panels and new types of windmills and technologies that produce electricity from environmental heat or waste heat, low temperature heat from conventional power plants. There's a lot of interesting technologies out there, but even the most interesting of them really does not compare to the ECAT. Just because the ECAT is here, it's been proven to work. The ECAT right now, not in the future, not 10 years from now, not 30 or 40 years from now, with hot fusion reactors that the mainstream media continually discuss. But right now, the ECAT can produce huge amounts of heat at very high COP for almost no fuel cost whatsoever. I believe that the fuel cost in this recent test that we will be discussing, it's probably around a penny's worth of fuel. Basically, a gram of fuel was placed in the reactor. The cost was basically nothing, but it produced 1.5 megawatt hours of electricity over 32 days. Just as an example, that's a huge amount of electricity for such a small amount of fuel. Basically, cold fusion and the ECAT, you can call it the Rossi tech, you can call it the Rossi effect, but this type of technology just seems to have all the benefits of conventional nuclear power with none of the drawbacks. There's no radioactive emissions. There's no nuclear waste produced. There's obviously no carbon or anything like that emitted from the reactor. It just seems to be ideal.
Okay. So yeah, you've studied the recent Lugano ECAT test. What's your assessment of this test as far as what you've learned about the ECAT from this test?
Well, the Lugano report was very important because it allowed for an extended run of a hot cat, basically an ECAT reactor that is designed to operate at very high temperatures, which is high temperatures are very important if you are seeking to convert heat to electricity efficiently. The higher stable temperatures you can produce, the higher efficiency you can convert the heat into electricity via traditional turbines, or with these higher temperatures, you could use thermovoltaic panels, which basically can convert the infrared radiation into electricity. But there's many different ways to convert the heat to electricity, but the higher temperature you can produce, it just gives you more options, and it allows the different methods to work more efficiently. And it demonstrated that. In one portion of the test, the reactor reached 1260 degrees Celsius. And in another portion of the test, the reactor reached 1400 degrees Celsius. And this is very significant because, for one thing, traditional power plants that burn coal or natural gas, or even nuclear power plants, they only produce steam on average from 500 to 600 degrees Celsius, sometimes lower. So this technology has proven to produce temperatures over the long term that far exceed what is required to produce electricity on a commercial basis. Also, very importantly, the device was tested the entire time with radiation detectors and Geiger counters and so forth, and there was no radioactive emissions from the device before or afterwards, even when it was at its maximum temperature. The technology also is seemingly truly nuclear, in that there are actual nuclear reactions taking place, even though no radiation such as gamma radiation was detected outside of the reactor, which is a good thing because it shows the extreme safety profile of this technology. But there were isotopic shifts in the fuel, which clearly show nuclear reactions were taking place. And this test overall basically proves that ECAT technology works. It really does produce excess heat, massive amounts of excess heat, and it demonstrates everything Rossi has been telling us all this time, that the technology really does work. And I know it just sounds like I'm being repetitive, but so many people have criticized the ECAT technology, saying it's snake oil, saying it's pseudoscience, making all kinds of horrible accusations of fraud and incompetence, and coming up with some very vindictive statements against Rossi, where this test, from what I can tell, and I should say I'm not a physicist, I'm not a trained engineer, but from what I can tell, it's very strong evidence, very strong, that the technology works like Rossi claims it does.
Okay. So you mentioned some of the criticisms that are out there. There are various people who said various things, that it's not a reliable test, that there's opportunities for trickery that went on there with Rossi being present and so forth. What are your response to some of those criticisms that you read about?
Well, the criticisms that I have read about, some of them are just downright almost ridiculous. Some people are very critical that Rossi was actually there and monitored the test for very brief periods of time, and actually, while under constant supervision by the testers, did things such as fuel the reactor and afterwards take the fuel out. and allow them to take samples for test. Some people think just because he was in the building, the test all of a sudden becomes unscientific and illegitimate. I think that's really ridiculous. Andrea Rossi allowed them to perform this test on a device where he's still trying to obtain IP protection, and he required certain security measures to protect his intellectual property, and I don't see a problem with that, especially because he was monitored by the testers at all times. But, other technical issues that I have heard pretty much have been debunked. In the last test, there was an argument from some skeptics or cynics that DC current may have inadvertently been transmitted to the reactor, and it wasn't measured, and it wasn't counted in the input. Well, they had a series of multimeters included in this test to show that no DC current went into the reactor whatsoever. There's also been an argument about the translucency of the alumina. Basically, the reactor in this test is about 20 centimeters long, 2 centimeters in diameter tube of aluminum oxide. And they tried to say that due to the fact alumina at certain temperatures can have a certain level of translucency to infrared radiation, that the test results were null because the infrared camera, would only be picking up the temperature of the internal heating coils and not the actual surface of the reactor. However, if you look up the data for the translucency of alumina at different temperatures in the range that the camera can pick up, basically the alumina is opaque. That means the infrared radiation cannot pass through directly through the alumina. So basically that's debunked. If you look at the camera profile and the actual data, there's a amp meter clamp inversion issue that certain people have brought up, but I don't see the merit in it because they are basically saying that it looks like a amp meter was misplaced, but that is causing, according to them, problems with the measurements. However, if that was the case, how were they able to correctly measure the power consumption of the control box, which they had specifications from the manufacturer? They measured that power correctly, and also when they ran the test on the dummy, they did one test of a control ECAT, basically the same reactor but without the charge placed inside, and they measured the heat production from the dummy compared to the power input, and it was perfect unity, a COP of 1. So if there was some measurement error that would have been causing big problems with any measurement, they couldn't have gotten that correct. That would have been impossible. And there's a couple other little issues here and there people are bringing up, but every time somebody brings up an issue, for the most part, somebody else has been able to explain it. Okay. So there are some questions that, should be asked just so we have a little bit more precise information about the test. But basically, the test is pretty solid, and it provides hard evidence that ECAT technology works.
Okay. Now, recently you have written and spoken up in favor of people trying to replicate this test, or just the ECAT in general. In your mind, why do you think that replication is an important issue?
Well, the response by the mainstream media and the mainstream science community to the positive supportive evidence in support of cold fusion that we have obtained via this report has been almost non-existent. It's like this report never happened. There's been a few little mentions here and there in the mainstream media, but for the most part, it's like the test never took place. I think the only way that the LENR community can convince the world that this technology exists, that it really does represent an ideal source of energy for the world, is via replication. I hope that people will be able to use the information that was obtained in this report to reproduce the results. And if, tens or dozens of different organizations around the planet could represent the results of this test by building, ECAT units from scratch, then I think that would just prove the issue once and for all. And the media would be forced to recognize this technology as being valid. And the scientific community would really have to wake up and realize that there's something far better than hot fusion technology, which they are currently still spending billions of dollars on every year. And hopefully the focus of global research when it comes to energy technologies could shift over to LENR.
Okay. So, do you feel like we have enough information to replicate at this point?
We have a great deal of information. This report has given us many, many clues, but more than just clues, some really big nuggets of information about how the ECAT works. For one thing, we have learned that lithium is very important in the reaction. Basically, lithium-7 is depleted in the test. The lithium in the fuel that has never been used, that was tested, had the normal isotopic ratio where the percentage of lithium-7, I believe, was about 93%. But in the ash of the test, the lithium level of lithium-7 had been reduced down to, I believe, 42.5% in one analysis and 7.9% in a second analysis. So we know that lithium-7 is potentially involved. We actually have a little bit of a theory or a hypothesis of a reaction that could actually be taking place. A fast proton may be interacting with the lithium-7 to produce beryllium, which can then decay into helium, and in the process release a large amount of energy, I believe 17 mega electron volts potentially. So we have an idea of that process. Also, we see that all the isotopes of nickel, which are in the perfectly natural isotopic fractions in the fuel, in the ash, all the isotopes of nickel seem to be depleted except for nickel-62, which is a minor isotope of nickel. There's relatively very little, I think about 3% of nickel-62 in ordinary nickel, but that was increased dramatically by the end of the test. So we have that information. We also know that iron was detected in the fuel in the ash. So that is potentially another catalyst. And we just basically have a good bit of information now. Oh, one other important bit of information, actually this is huge. The report that came out, actually there was two reports that recently came out. One that was an older analysis of the fuel, scanning electron microscope images of the nickel particles and other particles in the reactor was included. And we basically know the nickel used is in the form of carbonyl nickel. And carbonyl nickel in these images is basically maybe 3-4 microns in diameter. There's slightly different sizes, so maybe let's say 1 to 4 microns, and it has exotic surface features such as folds and cracks and geometric patterns and spiky little things coming off, or tubercles. And we know that's very important when it comes to replications, because Rossi has indicated in the past, early on, years ago, when he talked to a researcher that these surface features are vital to the technology and vital to the production of significant excess heat. So we basically know what the powder needs to look like going in. And there's some variables that remain. We don't know everything. There's still some questions. But I believe there's enough information to begin replication, and especially with some trial and error, if the people who set up to replicate, if the different groups that decide to replicate make it part of their plan to test many variations of the powder, varying the percentage of different elements, I think pretty much before too awful long, we would hit a combination that could potentially match the power output that Rossi's device can produce. And from there, the sky's the limit.
Okay. How would you suggest then, if someone wanted to make a replication effort, what would you suggest the steps they should take?
Well, first of all, I would be very careful. I don't recommend any just lone individual by themselves, unless they just happen to be an expert and happen to have access to a proper laboratory that has proper safety gear and they have experience handling all these chemicals. I don't really recommend for a garage tinkerer or even somebody that is more knowledgeable to do this on their own. I would advise people who are interested in replicating to, find professional, qualified individuals that are also interested, get together, talk about it, decide exactly what they want to test, and, figure out the kind of resources they need to obtain. And they need to find a safe location, maybe a university lab, or maybe a good private laboratory that will allow them to perform the test in a safe environment. Safety is always critical because although the ECAT does not produce dangerous amounts of radiation, in this recent test, no radiation was detected outside of the reactor. There are potentially hazardous and flammable chemicals that would be used as catalysts. For example, lithium aluminum hydride is considered to be potentially the source of the hydrogen in the ECAT, and it provides the lithium, which may act as a catalyst or fuel. But when exposed to moisture, even the humidity in the atmosphere, lithium aluminum hydride can become very flammable. So it would need to be handled with extreme care in a professional laboratory setting. Also, the nickel powder can be abrasive. It can be chemically active. It could, harm your skin, and if you breathed it in, it could cause you problems. Also, you'd be dealing with, fairly significant amounts of electricity, and as we know, getting shocked. Anybody who's ever touched a light switch with wet hands at the wrong moment and gotten a little bit zapped, knows electricity, being shocked by it is no fun whatsoever. It can be dangerous. And if you get shocked with too much electricity, you can actually die. So you need somebody that can manage the electrical usage. So basically, you'd have to be really careful. But once you get all that in place, I would basically recommend that they go over what the Martin Flashman Memorial Project is putting together for their replication plans. And I would suggest they look at the amount of money they need to raise, and what does not need to happen is for organizations to say, okay, let's test the ECAT. And they get a group of qualified people together and get a lab and build a device, replicate it, and run a handful of tests, see little to no excess energy, and then basically throw their hands in the air and give up. Andrea Rossi experimented with hundreds or thousands of combinations of fuel particles and different ratios of elements, and changing countless variables in his test for him to get the results he's getting today. And even though we have much more information now than we did a month ago, And even though we're far ahead of where Rossi was when he first began, there's still going to be variables that need to be tested. And I would say that any group that decides to replicate needs to plan to test, many different elements, and they need to run potentially dozens of tests. And if they cannot find the funding to do so, and if they're not willing to prepare to do that, then maybe they should rethink their efforts, and maybe they should consider joining with a larger project and contributing in that manner.
You mentioned the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project. I'm aware of that one. Do you know of any other attempts at this point?
Although I have read various comments on different forums and blogs where people hint that they are going to be replicating, for the most part, that's the only serious attempt I'm aware of at this time.
Okay. Do you have any expectation or any thoughts about how long it might take for some breakthrough to happen in these kind of efforts?
Well, once the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project, once they get the reactors set up and once they start testing, one good thing about the setup for their reactor they are going to build or plan on building, I don't think that maybe some of the final decisions have not been made yet. You will be able to change out the inner reactor core fairly easily. So they will be able to take out basically a test tube of fuel and then insert another one and then run another test and continue the process. So once they get going well, I believe that, maybe in a series of days, maybe a week or two, they should hit upon a combination of elements and isotopes and other variables that, produce significant amount of excess heat.
So you think it could be as soon as within days of these attempts? I mean, Rossi was working for years.
Well, it depends, how many reactors they have up and running at the same time. I believe that they should have as many up and running simultaneously as possible. And it has been mentioned they may have reactors running at 3 different sites simultaneously. And it just depends how many different combinations they are testing. I believe it may take tens or maybe hundreds, hopefully not hundreds, but potentially hundreds of combinations being tested. But depending on how many reactors they have and depending upon how many sites they are testing and how long they test each sample of powder, that might only take, a period of weeks. But you see, we know so much more now than Rossi did when he first started his testing. We basically have a recipe, or at least most of a recipe, for the so-called secret sauce of the ECAT. So I think we have a lot of clues now. We have a good bit of information. We just have to test different variables. We also have to test the type of electromagnetic stimulation that's taking place. That's another key aspect of the ECAT technology that should be mentioned. Basically, the powder in the ECAT is exposed to magnetic fields, potentially maybe RF energy from the alternating current going through the resistor. And there's different frequencies and harmonics of the AC power going through the resistor, and Rossi apparently has found one or more frequencies or harmonic patterns that excite the reactions in the ECAT, and we will have to test to try to find an optimum frequency that would promote the reactions as well. But hopefully, that is very doable, and I know the Martin Fleischmann project has actually obtained the same power controller that was used in the recent test. Interestingly enough, I think the name of the power controller is Microfusion. That's just a little trade name of it. It has nothing to do with Rossi. He does not sell this. This is an outside company. But their little power controller or power supply is called Microfusion. I thought that was kind of funny that it's being used in a cold fusion experiment. But, well, that's another thing that needs to be tested is the electromagnetic stimulation.
Okay. Now, some people have expressed concern about carrying out replication just because of maybe like intellectual property issues that Rossi or industrial heat might have, feeling that this is their work and let them do it, and we shouldn't be intruding on their territory, as it were. What do you think about that kind of position?
I'll answer that in two segments. First, I believe the number one concern needs to be safety with these tests. It is critical that any organization who tries to attempt to replicate an ECAT, or in this case the hot cat, they need to make sure they're doing so in a safe manner, working in a professional environment with all the safety equipment and safety protocols that are needed. The last thing we need to see happen is for some garage tinkerer, and there are some very bright, brilliant, smart people who build all kinds of amazing things in their garages. You can see the videos on YouTube. But the last thing we need to see happen is for somebody to get injured, or somebody get electrocuted, or someone to accidentally catch their home on fire. That would be a disaster. So safety has to be the number one concern here. Secondly, when it comes to intellectual property, any of these replications that are being conducted should be simply academic for the advancement of science and the understanding of LENR. If anyone has the idea that they are going to replicate this technology and then start selling it on their own and make money off of the work of Andrea Rossi and industrial heat, then they are doing this for the wrong reasons. No one should be doing this to try to get in, to try to make their own way into the market, basically. People who are replicating need to limit themselves to doing it for the reason to prove to the world this technology does indeed exist. But as long as that's the mindset of the people who are testing, I don't see the problem with applications. I think it's very much needed. And of course, who knows, if somebody gets some fantastic results and they find a brand new combination of fuels, and that just seems to be, that seems to advance Rossi's technology, because that's a possibility. If the world recognizes technology is real and hundreds of people are replicating, hundreds of teams around the world, maybe they could talk to industrial heat. I'm not saying that's a certainty. I'm not saying that's even a possibility, but basically, if anybody does get the idea of using something they learned for a commercial application, they should only do so if they did have an agreement with industrial heat. I want to put that out there. No one should try to commercialize anything they do replicate unless they have the explicit blessing of Andrea Rossi and industrial heat. But I don't see the problem with this. I personally think it's great if people can successfully replicate. It will prove to the world this technology exists. And if nobody does replicate, to be honest, we're going to be waiting another year or two for 1 megawatt plant to come out that Rossi is currently testing in the factory of a customer. And it's going to be a very long couple of years, and it will be a couple of years in which basically little to no progress outside of that one factory is made when it comes to obtaining a true viable technology that can replace all fossil fuels in traditional forms of energy.
So you're talking about recognition. I mean, we all know that most mainstream scientists regard LENR as sort of a place for deluded people to be involved in. What do you think would happen if there was a growing realization of the reality of this technology. What do you think? What impact do you think that would have on science and industry?
Oh, it would have a huge, enormous impact, and I'm very glad you asked this question. First of all, the most important thing would be it would shift. Of course, Andrea Rossi does not personally want to receive, from what I have read at least, money from the government to finance his research, but it would allow big projects like hot fusion to be abandoned, basically. We don't need hot fusion. With low-energy nuclear reactions, we can build amazing devices that produce huge amounts of energy in very small labs. We don't need billion-dollar projects with huge reactors that require hundreds of personnel to operate. So basically, the governments of the world and academic institutions of the world can hopefully transfer over the research to low-energy nuclear reactions. Also, I think it will be a good thing because I think money spent when it comes to inferior alternative energy technologies like solar power or wind, I think those industries will basically die off in time because coal fusion will basically be so much superior. I think at first, of course, the solar plants that are in usage will continue to produce electricity, or solar plants that are in the process of being built, will continue to be built, and they'll produce energy for decades. But I think financing for further research into solar power will basically dry up. And I think that's a good thing because this is a revolutionary, futuristic technology. When I think of LENR and cold fusion, it reminds me of the warp core of the Starship Enterprise. It reminds me of all these futuristic energy sources. And solar power just cannot compete. Solar power only produces power in certain weather conditions during the daytime. And the ECAT can produce huge amounts of power 24 hours a day, regardless of weather conditions. It doesn't need to be placed on your roof whether it's a large surface area. In the future, a home ECAT generator could be placed in your basement, or it could be placed in a closet, possibly. And I want to see the ECAT and these technologies that develop from the ECAT basically take the place of these inferior technologies. I think it's going to revolutionize everything. An unlimited source of dirt cheap, clean energy will revitalize the global economy. We're currently in a severe global recession, and it's really only getting worse. And we need something to spark a revitalization of the global economy, and I think this technology could do that.
Okay. What's your assessment of Andrea Rossi as a scientist and his position in science?
Well, Andrea Rossi, he is a very, very fascinating individual. In my opinion, he's a hybrid of Tesla and Edison combined into one. Nikola Tesla was the inventor of alternating current. He invented certain types of electric motors, X-rays. He had many, many inventions, and he was brilliant. Nikola Tesla, though, he came up with his inventions purely by inspiration. They just came to him in his mind, and he put it together in his mind, and then he instantly built it, and it worked. Edison, on the other hand, invented countless technologies. However, it was by pure effort, by trial and error. He would build something, tinker with it, build something, tinker with it, and continue to make variations of it until it worked. Like I think I remember reading an article where he had to try hundreds of different materials to come up with the filament for a light bulb to produce light. So Rossi's kind of a combination of both. He's an engineer, but he also has a great deal of scientific knowledge, and he's a businessman as well. So he basically has a grasp of many different fields, And I believe he has used the knowledge of industry, his knowledge of engineering, and his knowledge of science to basically come as far as he has come so far with the ECAT technology. Everything that has happened in his life has basically allowed him to gain experience and knowledge to push past all the obstacles to the ECAT and push past all the criticism and push past the other obstacles and basically develop a viable working technology. And this test that was recently performed proved to any reasonable individual that it does indeed work.
Okay. What would you predict as far as, I don't know, let's say within the next 5 years, where do you see this technology being 5 years from now?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think that depends, however, if successful replications take place. If successful replications take place, which could potentially happen, depending on how much we really do know about the catalyst of the ECAT, because there are still some unknowns. If successful replications take place soon, within the next couple of months, or maybe a little bit longer than that, basically the world will have a head start on developing this technology and learning about it. And I think it will cause, a huge revolution when it comes to scientific understanding, because this will be a much bigger story than just a new type of solar panel or a more efficient light bulb or a more energy-dense lithium-ion battery. This is far bigger than any of that. And I believe that it would make the existence of this technology, once the world completely recognizes it as every bit as real as any other technology, I believe it would just inspire so many people to dive into this field. But if replications do not take place, we'll have to wait at least another year to basically learn more about Andrea Rossi's 1 megawatt plant. And then that may hopefully inspire more interest in the mainstream media, but we don't know if it would or not. It depends how open it was and what information the customer was willing to share and the amount of information Industrial Heat would be willing to share. And then it may take even longer for additional customers to come forward and give information about how they are using the ECAT. And I believe in 5 years, even if a replication does not take place, I believe the ECAT technology will be in the marketplace. It will be producing power. And hopefully by then cold fusion will be accepted. But I don't think it will take 5 years for significant progress and acceptance to have taken place. If we can do replications now, a replication accelerates everything. A replication is a win-win-win for Rossi, it's a win for Industrial Heat, and it's a win for the testers, and it's a win for the world. It will bring instant credibility to Rossi, although I believe these tests conclusively show his technology does work. The mainstream media has basically ignored them, but they will be forced to admit and cover the ECAT if hundreds of different parties around the world are replicating. So it would bring Rossi credibility, Industrial Heat credibility. It would protect the reputations of the testers who participated in this last test of the ECAT. They took a big risk signing on to that report because there's still a major stigma attached to cold fusion. There's a lot of people out there who still consider it snake oil, and they consider it pseudoscience, and they believe that anybody that's performing cold fusion tests are basically cracks and out of their mind lunatics. And we can see the skeptics online, when there is a positive article posted online about cold fusion, in the few mainstream websites that have discussed the ECAT, the cynics appear out of nowhere and start mocking Andrea Rossi and start attacking Industrial Heat and start making all kinds of baseless, false allegations. but I just really think replications are the key to accelerating the whole process and getting this technology accepted. And hopefully within 5 years, if replications do take place, maybe the very first LENR powered vehicles will be, coming off the assembly line, possibly. Maybe that's a little optimistic, but I would love to see that. Maybe in 5 years, the first, industrial heat will be working with additional partners, perhaps, on the first home generators that could produce electricity for your home, and maybe hot water at the same time via cogeneration. The first ones of those could be really mass marketed.
Now, one thing that has been noted by some people is this most recent test. The COP was between 3.2 and 3.6, which for some people was a bit of a disappointment because it was only, that's not really enough in order to drive a power plant. If you want to if the ECAT's going to be an efficient source of power, because remember, there's got to be a lot of power input into this. So how do you feel about that, the low COP measured in this test, and what it could mean for the future?
You're correct. In this test, the COP did vary between approximately 3.2 and about 3.8 at the maximum. However, what people need to realize about this test is that it was performed basically with the foot on the brakes the entire time. You see, the ECAT has the capability, all models of the ECAT have had the capability of self-sustaining. Basically, when you stimulate the nuclear reactions to a certain level, they no longer require external input to continue, and they can continue producing heat with no outside power. That means that infinite COP, because you have output power continuously being produced with no input. In this test, to make the calculations and equations more simple, they just had a continual input of power. They also avoided self-sustain mode, and there's a couple other modes of operations called start-stop, in which you start the reactor up, you stimulate it for a little bit, then you turn off the stimulation, and then you let it slowly, the temperature reduce, and then you stimulate it again, and then you turn off the power and let the reactions slowly fade a little bit. There's several different modes of operation that would have allowed for much higher COP. With this stop-start mode that they chose not to use, I believe the COP could have been, who knows, maybe 10 or higher would have been very possible. But with self-sustain mode, the COP could have been infinite. So basically what people need to remember is this test was not designed. The purpose of this test was not to show the maximum COP capable with this technology. It was only to show that this technology can produce an amount of energy that far exceeds any known chemical reaction. And it succeeded in that. For the duration of this test, 1.5 megawatt hours of energy was produced, and that's enormous. And that is from 1 gram of active material inside the reactor. But even if you consider the whole weight of the reactor, which was approximately a little bit under 500 grams, or half a kilogram, even if you factor that in, all known chemical reactions or chemical sources of power can be eliminated. So this test was a success. And in future tests that want to push higher COP, I'm sure they are capable of doing so. One of my hopes for the Martin Flashman Memorial Project is that if they can find the ideal combination of powders and elements and electromagnetic stimulation, that they will be able to demonstrate self-sustain mode. Because self-sustain mode would not only be the ultimate form of LENR, but it would also cut through any of these false arguments the skeptics are proposing. Because if you have a device continually self-sustaining with no input power, that proves beyond any doubt there's nuclear reactions taking place. This report has proved nuclear reactions due to the isotopic shifts in the ash, and because of the fact so much power was produced that far exceeds nuclear reactions. But just being able to show self-sustain mode, there's just something about it where you have huge amounts of output with no input, so you don't have to worry about measurement errors and calculations of the input because there's no power going in. And basically, if you have a high temperature hunk of metal and you have no input power, if there were no nuclear reactions taking place, the temperature of that hunk of metal would drop quickly, and it would drop rapidly. There's no way that it would stay the same temperature for, even a minute, much less 30 minutes or an hour. There's been tests already performed, one by Dr. Livy years ago with an earlier model of the ECAT, in which a reactor self-sustained for approximately 18 hours. Of course, it was a low-temperature version of the ECAT, and there have been many changes since then, but that test proves self-sustain is possible. And there's been other tests as well. So I think people don't need to get bogged down in the COP produced in this last report, because in future replications, I am certain beyond any doubt that COP will go up. If we can hit the right combination to produce the Rossi effect, then I believe it will be simple to show self-sustain mode. We have even been told by associates of Rossi who have went on certain online forums such as CoBraf, one user that goes by the handle Cures, he has told us that Rossi's reactors naturally want to continue to go up in temperature and self-sustain, but the effort has to be to keep them stable and keep the power output compared to power input balanced so they don't run away and basically destroy the reactor. So self-sustain is within reach, high COPs are within reach, and this technology is fully capable of producing electricity in industrial settings.
Okay. My understanding is that the plants that Rossi is working with, they have a higher COP because they're actually guaranteed performance levels that they have to meet in order to make the sale. So I'm not sure what that performance level is, but Rossi has mentioned that his...
In the past,
okay.
I was going to say, in the past, Rossi has mentioned a COP of 6 repeatedly when it comes to the minimum performance of his technology,
Yep.
when it comes to, what he wants in potential products. However, I believe that can go up dramatically, and I'm hoping that with this 1 megawatt plant that is currently in the factory, I'm hoping when the test data comes out from that plant, performance data actually, because it's sitting there in operation, working for the customer every single day, I'm hoping the data will show that it has produced a COP of over 6. I think that's pretty likely.
Yeah. Okay. So, Hank, as we close up here, what kind of role do you like to play? You're obviously very interested in this technology. What do you see your contribution being?
Well, although I've had an interest in science and technology ever since I was a young child, I'm not a physicist, I'm not an engineer. But what I'm pretty good at is performing research, looking up information, and summarizing it in ways people can understand. So I'm hoping that I can perhaps continue doing what I have been doing, gathering information about the ECAT, putting together articles for Sterling Allen, and hopefully, spreading the news about the technology, the good news about this technology, that a paradigm-shattering technology that can replace all traditional forms of power exists. And hopefully I can just continue what I have been doing. I like, reading about the different revelations that come forward. I like to study how the technology may work. Although I'm not a physicist and I cannot completely understand some of these advanced papers that have, very complicated equations and calculus and so forth, I'm pretty good at getting the gist of them, and I like to share what I do and understand with others. So hopefully I can just keep on doing what I have been doing.
Okay, well, we'll certainly be watching for your articles published usually on PESN Wiki, right? That's where you're mainly.
Yep, that's where they mainly are. And one thing I do want to say is I know everyone in the LENR community appreciates your efforts on ECAT World. You provide a great service to the LENR community. Your website truly is probably the #1 source of information for ECAT news on the internet. So keep on doing what you've been doing because you're doing a great job.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Hank. It's great to have you with us tonight, and we'll stay in touch, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you very much for having me.